Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening a file on a place that, well, it effectively breaks all the conventional rules of what we think of as urban success.
He really does.
We're heading down to the Florida Panhandle, but I want you to just for a moment erase that mental image you probably have.
Right. Forget the spring break crowds.
Exactly. Forget the high-rise condos and all the airbrush tourist traps. We are zooming in on a very specific neighborhood called St. Andrews.
And our mission for this deep dive really is to trace a fascinating and I think a very specific arc.
It is a fascinating arc because on paper, this place really shouldn't exist. Or at the very least, it shouldn't look the way it does today.
That's so true. Usually when we look at the history of a town, what are we looking for? We're looking for the victories.
Big wins, yeah. The day the railroad arrived.
Or when the big industry boomed or the population just exploded. But the sources we're digging into today, especially stories of St. Andrews, they tell a completely different story. It's a story of what you might call successful failure.
Successful failure. That's it. That's the core tension we need to unpack today. Because when you look at the scorecard, and we're going to cover it milestone by milestone, St. Andrews technically lost every major economic battle it ever fought.
Every single one. It lost the railroad.
Lost it. It lost the deep water port.
Lost that too. And it definitely lost the mass tourism war.
But, and this is the whole point, if you visit today, you realize that by losing all those battles, it somehow won the war for its own soul.
It's a classic case, really. It's an example of how getting left behind by what we call industrial progress can actually be the very thing that saves a community's character.
Okay, so let's start right there. Let's set the scene for the listener. If you were to walk around St. Andrews today, not the history, but the now what does that successful failure actually look and feel like on the ground?
It feels like a living room, not a theme park. That's probably the best way I can describe
I
it.
like that, a living room.
Yeah, because all that heavy industry went somewhere else. What you're left with is this walkable, human-scale waterfront village. You've got a working marina where you can literally walk right up to the shrimp boats as they come in.
You can smell the salt in the air.
You can. And there's this distinct salty vibe, and we'll get into the original meaning of that word, but it means independent restaurants, live music spilling out of little bars, a fierce, almost stubborn local pride.
It feels authentic.
It feels authentic because it is. It wasn't manufactured by a developer in a boardroom. It just it evolved through sheer survival.
Okay, so to understand how we got to this walkable village, we have to rewind. We have to go way back to when the map was basically blank. Or, maybe more accurately, when the map just kept changing.
That's a great point. The outline calls this the changing flags era, but looking at the geological data, it seems like the land itself was changing flags, so to speak.
So before we even get to the people, we have to talk about the ground beneath their feet.
We have to. You have to respect the geographic canvas, as the sources put it. Early Spanish explorers in the 1500s, they named the bay Bahia de San Andres.
And that was just because they happened to be sailing by on a certain day.
Pretty much. The story goes they spotted the bay on the feast day of St. Andrew, so the name stuck. But here's the crucial part. If you compare a map from, say, 1764 against a U.S. coastal survey from 1855, you are not looking at the same coastline.
It's not the same place.
Not at all. The entrance to the bay, the pass, was constantly migrating. Nature was and is incredibly violent here. A big hurricane would come through and just shatter the barrier islands, carving out new deep water channels miles up or down the coast.
So for centuries, this wasn't a place you'd think to build a city. It was a place you tried to survive.
Exactly. It was a temporary stop, which explains why for so long nobody really stayed.
You mentioned the changing flags. You had Spain, then Britain, then the U.S. trading ownership.
Yeah.
It sounds like a game of geopolitical hot potato.
It does. And what did that mean for anyone who might have wanted to settle? It meant chaos. The British would come in and grant land titles. Then the Spanish would take it back and declare all those grants void. Then the Americans take over. It created this legal and environmental limbo.
So you could never be sure you actually owned your own land.
Never. And that kept St. Andrews as a seasonal fishing camp for centuries. It was a place to stop, fix your boat, dry your nets, maybe trade a little, and then leave.
Until a man named John Clark arrives. This is our first major milestone in the outline. The arrival of John Clark. And this guy wasn't just another fisherman passing through.
No, not at all. And this is where the entire psychology of the place begins to shift. John Clark arrived in the late 1820s, and he was a heavyweight. We're talking about the former governor of Georgia.
Okay, so a man of some stature,
Immense stature for the time, and when a man like that arrives on a remote, windswept bluff and decides to build a substantial permanent home, he is sending a very clear signal.
He's planting a flag for real this time.
Exactly. He represents the shift from, let's say, camping to permanence. He chose that high bluff, what we now call Old Town, for a reason. It was defensible, it was stable, and he built a real life there. He wasn't just passing through.
And he had big plans, right? He didn't just see a home, he saw a city.
He saw a metropolis, he wanted to dig canals, he envisioned a customs district, he saw a major port, he saw the potential that no one else had acted on.
But there's a tragic irony here that really seems to set the tone for the rest of St. Andrew's history.
It really does. Clark died in 1832, very shortly after arriving, maybe 5 years. He never lived to see even the beginnings of the boom he envisioned.
So his dream died with him.
Not entirely, and this is the key. The settlement didn't just vanish when he died. The seed of permanence had been planted. People saw that you could live here year-round. You could build a life. The idea was out there.
And living there meant dealing with the ocean, with the bay. This brings us to a phrase that I see plastered everywhere in the modern marketing materials: salty. But this deep dive suggests this isn't about sea spray and flip-flops.
Not at all. We need to strip away the modern salt life sticker idea completely. The original meaning of salty in St. Andrews is literal, it's industrial, and frankly, it's violent. To understand it, we have to look at the Civil War era.
It's easy to forget that something as simple as salt was a major strategic weapon in the 1860s.
It was the uranium of the 19th century. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. There was no refrigeration. If you didn't have salt, you couldn't preserve beef or pork.
And if you can't preserve meat,
The Confederate Army starves. It was that simple. So the Confederacy was desperate for salt, and St. Andrews had the two ingredients you needed in abundance: endless salty seawater and endless pine forests to burn for heat.
so the quiet little settlement became a factory. What would that have actually looked like?
It would have looked like an industrial hellscape, honestly. We aren't talking about cute little evaporation pans on the beach. We are talking about hundreds of massive cast iron kettles, some 5-6 feet across, boiling seawater 24 hours a day.
The smoke must have been unbelievable.
Thick enough to choke you. They were clear-cutting the pristine pine forests for miles inland just to feed the fires. It was a massive, dirty, vital industry.
And being a strategic factory makes you a strategic target.
A prime target. This is the destruction that the source material talks about. Between 1862 and 1863, the Union Navy launched a series of raids specifically to wipe this salt-making capacity off the map.
And they weren't gentle about it.
They didn't just knock things over. They came ashore with landing parties armed with sledgehammers and systematically smashed the iron kettles. They used cannonballs to blast apart the brick masonry works. The records say they destroyed over 290 distinct salt works.
And what about the town itself? The homes that had been built since John Clark's time?
Collateral damage. They burned all 32 houses in the settlement to the ground. St. Andrews was, for the second time in its life, physically erased from the map.
So when we talk about salty resilience, this is the origin point. This is where it's forged. It's not just an attitude. It's the literal fact that the people stood in the ashes of their homes and their livelihoods and decided to stay.
Precisely. Can you imagine the grit required to look at a smoking ruin where your house used to be and say, nope, we're going to rebuild right here? That kind of shared trauma forges a community identity like nothing else. They became people who could take a hit.
And rebuild they did. So let's fast forward a bit, post-war, to the 1880s. The town is back on its feet, and the center of gravity shifts directly to the water's edge. We have to talk about Ware's Wharf.
Yes, the Where the Town Met the Tide chapter. This is so crucial because you have to remember, in the 1880s, roads basically didn't exist in this part of Florida. The water was the highway. It was everything.
So a dock wasn't just a place to tie up a boat.
Not even close. Two brothers, Lambert and Francis Ware, arrived and built this wharf. But you shouldn't just picture a few wooden planks over the water.
It was more than that.
It was the town center, it was the post office, it was the news bureau, the marketplace, the shipping office, all rolled into one structure. Ware's Wharf was the internet of the 19th century for St. Andrews.
The information hub.
Exactly. If you wanted to know who died, who got married, what the price of fish was in Pensacola, or when the next steamer was due, you went down to Ware's Wharf. It anchored the entire economy and social life of the town.
And having that solid anchor, that connection point, allowed outsiders to discover the place all over again. Which leads us to one of the wildest stories in this whole stack, when Cincinnati discovered St. Andrews.
Oh, this one is a classic. or as I like to call it, the mail order city. This was the Cincinnati scheme, which ran roughly from 1885 to 1888. A development company based in Ohio decided they were going to market St. Andrews as the ultimate tropical paradise to the industrial Midwest.
And the scale of this marketing blitz was just insane for the time. 350,000 pamphlets.
It was a full-on saturation campaign. They mailed them to factory workers, farmers, anyone stuck in the cold and the soot of Ohio and Pennsylvania. And the pamphlets were, let's just say they were very creative with the truth.
They weren't exactly selling reality.
They were selling a dream. Escape the snow, escape the grime, come to sunny Florida where the fruit practically falls into your lap. They were selling this yeoman farmer fantasy of living off the land in paradise.
But the reality on the ground was a little bit different.
The reality was a borderline disaster. First, they platted these lots to be incredibly narrow. Some were just 25 feet wide. You can't farm a 25-foot wide strip of sand. It's impossible.
And I'm guessing there wasn't a lot of infrastructure waiting for these new arrivals.
There was zero infrastructure, no railroad, no real roads, no stores to buy supplies. People would sell everything they owned in Cincinnati, take a train down to Pensacola, then a boat over to St. Andrews, and they'd step off Ware's Wharf onto scrub brush and sand.
It was the boom that didn't boom.
For most, yes. A lot of them left immediately feeling completely scammed, and they were. But, and here's that successful failure theme popping up again, not everyone left.
Some stayed.
A few hardy souls stayed. The scheme, despite its failures, did two things. One, it put St. Andrews on the national map. And two, it brought a very specific type of person who looked past the lies, saw the raw beauty of the bay, and was stubborn enough to decide they could make it work anyway. It accidentally filtered the population for resilience.
But even the most resilient people still needed supplies. They needed a connection to the outside world. And since the railroads still hadn't arrived, they were totally dependent on one single boat, the SS Tarpon.
The Gulf Coast steamer and community lifeline. You really cannot overstate how important this one single vessel was to the survival of St. Andrews. Its captain, Willis Greenborough, ran it like clockwork for decades.
There's that great quote from him in the notes. God makes the weather, I make the trip. That is some serious confidence for a Gulf Coast captain.
He was an absolute legend. For over 30 years, from the early 1900s until its tragic sinking in 1937, the Tarpon was the town's umbilical cord. It brought the mail, the ice, the food, the tools, the people.
So if the Tarpon didn't run,
St. Andrews didn't eat. It's that simple. It really underscores just how isolated this salty little community still was, even into the 20th century.
okay, so now we're approaching the real pivotal moment, the turn of the century. This is the moment where the path of St. Andrews permanently diverges from the path of the rest of the region. And to understand it, we have to introduce the man who, in a way, connected the bay, George M. West.
George West is arguably the most complex and important figure in this entire story. He was a newspaper publisher, a relentless promoter, and a developer. And here's the key. He lived in St. Andrews. He loved St. Andrews.
But he was also a businessman who looked at a map and saw the future.
An enormous future. And the future he saw was linked to something happening thousands of miles away, the construction of the Panama Canal.
How do they connect?
West was obsessed with the idea. He believed that this deep, protected bay could become a major global port, a primary gateway for ships coming to and from the Panama Canal. But he faced what the source calls a founder's dilemma.
A dilemma how?
The place he loved, St. Andrews, was already a settled village. It was built out with homes and shops right up to the water. It was charming, but it was small. It didn't have the vast, empty tracts of land you'd need for massive rail yards and industrial docks.
So to realize his grand vision for the bay, he had to look beyond his own
He
town.
had to make a choice. And he looked to the east, to the empty pine forests just a few miles away from St. Andrews, and he began to promote that land as the future city.
And he gave it a very specific name.
He did. He named it Panama City to explicitly, shamelessly hook its destiny to the canal hype.
Wait a minute. So the man who lived in and loved St. Andrews essentially birthed its biggest rival right next door.
That is exactly what happened, and it created a ton of friction. The old sources talk about a massive feud between West, who saw himself as a reform-minded publisher, and the established industrialists like W.C. Sherman. But in the end, the geography dictated the decision. West realized that for the region to truly boom, the center of economic gravity had to shift away from his own front porch.
And this leads to another major event in the outline. the founder's dilemma and annexation. It wasn't just about a new town. It was about St. Andrews losing its independence.
Right. As Panama City grew, fueled by West's promotion and later the railroad, there was immense political and economic pressure to consolidate. Why have three separate little towns, St. Andrews, Millville, and Panama City, competing for resources?
It makes sense from a purely administrative point of view.
It does. And so eventually, St. Andrews and Millville were officially annexed. They were absorbed into the larger, newer entity of Panama City.
So St. Andrews lost its own government, its own name on the map as a city.
It lost its municipal independence, yes, but it retained its distinct identity. It became a village within the city, a neighborhood with its own history, rather than a rival city. This was a huge turning point.
And that ship became locked in permanently with the arrival of the railroad. This is the chapter that introduces A.B. Steele.
A.B. Steele, the timber magnate, the outsider with the capital. Everyone in St. Andrews had been praying for a railroad since the days of the Cincinnati scheme. It was the one thing they thought they needed to truly succeed.
And in 1908, it finally happens. Steele brings the Atlanta and St. Andrews Bay Railroad, the Bay Line, down to the coast.
This is the moment they'd all been waiting for.
And it has to be the single biggest heartbreak in the town's history.
Without a doubt, because the rails did not terminate in St. Andrews. They ran right past it and terminated in the new Panama City.
Why? Was it just because of George West's marketing? Or was there more to it?
It was pure physics and economics. Panama City had the deep water right next to the empty land. Steele was a timber guy. He needed to run his railroad tracks right up to the docks where ships would be waiting.
And you couldn't do that in St. Andrews.
Not without bulldozing the entire existing town. So, the train went east, and where the train goes, the heavy industry follows. The warehouses, the factories, the naval stores processors, the wholesale shippers, they all set up shop along the rail lines in Panama City. And St. Andrews was left. Well, it was left stranded as a maritime and fishing village.
It's just amazing to think about that moment. They must have felt like they had completely missed the boat, or literally missed the train, the ultimate failure.
Oh, they were devastated economically. It must have felt like the end. But now let's zoom out to today. Because the train didn't come to St. Andrews, its waterfront wasn't paved over with concrete bulkheads.
The historic homes weren't torn down for warehouses.
The walkable grid wasn't destroyed for real spurs. That singular failure to get the railroad is the only reason St. Andrews still has the charm that defines it today.
The loss was a preservative. That is such a crucial point. But we shouldn't pretend St. Andrews just became a sleepy little village with nothing going on. There was another major economy happening in the background. When the bay met the pines.
That's right, we have to look inland. The green inventory, as the sources call it. The economy of the Florida Panhandle has always stood on two legs: the salt water of the bay and the pine sap from the forests.
Turpentine.
Turpentine and naval stores pitch, tar. It was brutal, hot, difficult work out in those pine forests, but it generated a tremendous amount of cash for the region. And eventually, this industry evolved.
Into the paper industry.
Exactly. The St. Joe Paper Company becomes a massive player in the 20th century. They shifted from just harvesting old-growth trees to managing vast tracts of land for pulp and paper.
And how did that connect back to the families living in St. Andrews?
Jobs. Good, steady, blue-collar jobs. Even if the paper mill wasn't physically in St. Andrews, the people who lived in those small wooden houses in St. Andrews worked in the timber industry or at the mill or in supporting roles. It created a stable, working class, middle class.
So it didn't just become a resort town for the wealthy or a forgotten backwater.
No, it remained a real working community because the pine forests were paying the bills that the fishing boats couldn't always cover.
So you have this balance. The bay provides the identity, the pines provide the jobs, but then the physical shape of the water starts changing again. We need to talk about the ditch and the war on the water.
The ditch is a great nickname. It refers to the long sought-after quest for a permanent deep water channel into the bay. The locals knew that to be a serious port, even for Panama City, they needed a reliable harbor that didn't shift with every hurricane.
And this is where the federal government steps in.
In the 1930s and 40s, the Army Corps of Engineers finally comes in and builds the jetties, those massive granite block structures you can still see today. They effectively locked the pass in place.
Which turned the bay from a shifting lagoon into a serious industrial asset, just in time for World War II.
Perfect timing. The Wainwright shipyard springs up almost overnight. This was the moment of maximum industrialization for the entire bay. They were building and launching Liberty ships for the war effort at an incredible pace.
But again, let's look at the map. Where was the shipyard?
It was in Panama City, right next to the railhead. Where else could it be?
And after the war, that massive shipyard infrastructure didn't just go away.
No, it was converted. It became the official modern port of Panama City. And that permanently moved all heavy cargo, all industrial shipping, away from the old St. Andrews waterfront for good.
So let's recap the failures. Strike 1, the railroad goes to Panama City. Strike 2, the deepwater port goes to Panama City. St. Andrews is left with its fishing fleet and its charm.
And then comes strike 3, the Hathaway Bridge.
The gateway to the beaches.
Exactly. The first bridge was a low-draw bridge built in 1929. It was later upgraded over the decades to the modern spans we have today, but that bridge, more than anything else, changed the flow of money in the region.
How so?
Suddenly, the tourists weren't coming to the bay for the old hotels in St. Andrews or Panama City. They were driving across the bay to get to the sugar white sands of Panama City Beach.
So St. Andrews gets bypassed again. First by heavy industry, now by mass tourism.
Completely bypassed. The economic center of gravity for tourism shifted west to the beach. For a while there, St. Andrews was in real danger of becoming a ghost town, or at best, just a rundown, forgotten neighborhood.
But it didn't. It had to reinvent itself one more time. And the anchor for that final reinvention seems to be the St. Andrews Marina.
Where the town meets the water. The construction of the formal St. Andrews Marina in the post-war era around 1960 was a profound declaration of identity.
How do you mean?
It was the town saying, okay, we are not a cargo port, we are not a tourist trap, we are a maritime community. It was a home built specifically for the shrimp boats, the charter captains, the oystermen, and the local folks who just loved the water. It formalized the town's true relationship with the bay.
It became the public square, the living room you talked about.
It absolutely did, and that marina proved its value as the cultural anchor through the storms. We have to bring up that resilience theme one last time. Hurricane Opal in '95 did a lot of damage, but then came the monster, Hurricane Michael, in 2018.
Michael was a high-end Category 5. It didn't just damage the marina, it annihilated it.
It was devastating. I mean, just splinters and concrete rubble. But what happened next is the whole story of St. Andrews in miniature. Just like after the Union raids burned the town down, the community didn't abandon the waterfront. They fought to rebuild it.
They saw it as essential.
They treated that marina as essential public infrastructure, not just for the economy, but for the town's very soul. The rebuilding of that marina is the latest chapter in that long, salty story.
So we've traced this incredible arc, from John Clark standing on a bluff to the salt works, the failed Cincinnati scheme, the missed railroad, the bypassed tourists, and the rebuilt marina. We come back to our core question. Why St. Andrews? Why did it survive and become what it is?
I think it comes back to that central idea of adaptation through loss. St. Andrews survives and thrives in its own way precisely because it never got what it thought it wanted.
It wanted the train. It wanted the factories. It wanted to be the hub.
It wanted to be the industrial powerhouse. But because it lost all of those things to Panama City, and because it later lost the mass tourists to the beach, it was forced to retain its human scale. It won the war for its own livability by losing everything else.
It's such a powerful, counterintuitive lesson for modern urban planning, isn't it? We are so obsessed with growth at all costs, with optimization.
We are. We think every town needs to be a metropolis, every waterfront needs a container terminal or a row of condos, but St. Andrews suggests that sometimes being the runner-up is the best possible outcome.
It's a place that was forged by its successful failures.
That's the perfect way to put it. That's the whole story.
And maybe it leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. In a world that's increasingly filled with generic, placeless development, is the failure to continuously boom actually the secret to building a place that people genuinely want to live in? The story of St. Andrews seems to suggest the answer is yes.
I think it does. Stay salty.
Well, that is a fantastic perspective to end on. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you on